Evening. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Father Jean-Pierre, and I'm the director for the International Leadership Program. I am from Africa, and it's a little cold outside. For someone from Africa, this is a little dangerous. I remember when I first arrived here, my chair, dissertation chair, told me not to seek any job in Minnesota. Otherwise, I could die. But I've been here for 8 years and I'm still alive. But for sure, it's getting very cold. We are expecting some people to come, but we should get started. And as you know, we love our phones, but this may be the time when we turn them off. This is the International Leadership Forum, and this will be our 6th forum. We hold this every year. We do have actually 2 of them. And the International Leadership Program trains students to be global leaders who are knowledgeable in international development, international education, international economy, and governance. And so besides the courses, we have this additional treat for you, the forum. And we also have a course that goes overseas, and we call it Leadership in International Context. We visited twice South Africa. We went to Tanzania twice, and this year, for those of you who would like to go back to Tanzania, we're leaving on the 5th of July of 2014. And after that, we're planning to go to Brazil. So it's actually my pleasure to welcome all of you here. I would like to acknowledge the presence of some of our board members. I also acknowledge the presence of the Murray Institute that really funds and sponsors this event. And I acknowledge the presence of all our students, particularly those who went to Tanzania with me. And those, their own students that they brought here today. You are all welcome. The program today is very short. After I have said the word that I was supposed to say, I would invite our dean to introduce the speaker for today. And after that, we may collect some questions for about 30 minutes, and then we're done. But feel free to walk outside. We have some flyers for you. Anything you would like to know about the International Leadership Program or our college, you can find it outside. So it's now my pleasure to introduce to you the Dean of the College of Education, Leadership and Counseling, Dr. Mark Salsbury.
Well, thank you, Father Jean-Pierre. It's encouraging to me, since my family and I just moved here from New Mexico less than 3 months ago. So it's encouraging to me to know that you're still alive after 8 years of moving to the Twin Cities and going through these winters. So that's very encouraging. When I read about Thomas Hanson and he was going to speak tonight, I thought to myself, there's a guy I want to meet. And so we're very happy that you're here at this leadership forum tonight. We're very happy that Thomas Hanson is here. And in case you don't know, I have a little thing here to read about him so I don't mess it up. And so that we can see how much expertise and experience he brings to this forum tonight. So, Thomas Hanson is a former career Foreign Service officer. While with the U.S. Department of State, his foreign postings included East Germany, France, Norway, the Soviet Union, Sweden, and Georgia. He also assisted in opening new embassies in Mongolia and Estonia. Mr. Hanson has worked on the Foreign Relations Committees of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, and most recently, he was Director for NATO and European Affairs at the Atlantic Council of the United States in Washington, D.C. Currently, he serves as a lecturer and consultant for the Great Decisions Program at the Minnesota International Center and works with the Oslo Center for Peace and Human Rights, which is a U.S. foundation. He's also a diplomat in residence at the Allworth Institute for International Studies at the University of Minnesota at Duluth. So please join me in welcoming Thomas Hanson.
Thank you very much. Let's see, I think I better turn this one off, I believe. Let's see. Let me get a little bit. Okay. Sorry for the delay on this. Yeah, so we don't use that one too. Yep. Wow, okay. Dean Salsbury, thank you very much for your kind introduction. I want to thank Father Jean-Pierre Bongila for inviting me tonight. I also thank other members of the board who are here tonight, and thank you all for turning out on an evening like this. It's a very nice turnout, and I look forward to talking to you about the themes that you're dealing with in this program. Themes of leadership, development, ethics, ways to engage in this world of ours, which is so fascinating and wonderful, and yet so plagued with problems and issues. So I want to offer just some reflections about this range of issues tonight. I feel very privileged to have been able to serve in a wide range of sectors of international affairs. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Kenya, which was a really formative experience living in Africa and seeing the people there, the traditions, the issues. I worked, as you know, in the State Department for up to 25 years, mainly in Eurasia, I guess you'd say, in Europe, parts of Asia, former Soviet Union. I worked for 2 years in the Congress as a staffer on the Senate and House Foreign Relations Committee and saw how the Congress interacts with our policies. And more recently, I've worked with NGOs, non-governmental organizations. All of these are key areas where we need bright minds. We need people like you all to engage and reach out to the world, whether, as I say, in the private sector, government, NGO work. When you look at the range of problems out there, day to day in our newspapers, when you see the scale of the problems and the seemingly inexorable patterns and repetitions of history that just keep coming back at us, there's a temptation to withdraw and to settle into the world of infotainment, sports, find salvation in kind of an immediate existence with friends and family. And in that way, you still are impacted. I'm over at the U quite a bit. In the Dinkytown area, the citizens have been up in arms about local development. The local issues stir them to action. The thing is that in our world today of globalization, all this interconnectedness, these international issues are every bit as immediate, whether we know it or not. They're every bit as immediate in our lives. And so the challenge and the necessity of getting involved, I think, is great. The Christian faith has a long tradition of charity, of salvation through good works. The Jewish faith has what they call tikkun olam, which means mending the world. It's a very deep concept. There are many ethical reasons for getting involved in addition to the immediate ones. But it's difficult because in many ways the contexts right now are frayed. Even though this world is out there impacting us, I will argue that there are some disconnects. I'm going to reach back. Didn't expect to see him, did you? This is good old Immanuel Kant, who was a German philosopher in the 1700s. He wrote a book that is still quite influential and is cited a lot, called On Perpetual Peace. And he talked about how citizens of a republic, in other words, true citizens, will have an opinion because their lives are at stake. If their country goes to war, they're the ones who pay the price, and so they're going to have an opinion they're going to voice. And as a result, a republic will be less inclined, for example, to go to war. But he said 2 conditions must be met. Number one, the elites of the country must be equally exposed to the perils of potential war. In other words, there must be a draft. Now, in my generation, there was. And American policy was a daily thing for us during the Vietnam years. Right now, there is no draft, as we know. And to this extent, there's a disconnect. The other point that Kant made in this work of over 200 years ago was that there should be, he said, an international convention, an international law, that no country at war should be allowed to run a deficit, because that hides the true cost from the citizens of the republic. So, we have issues on both fronts, I would argue. The other disconnect, I believe, comes in our media. This is a stamp of a Minnesota native. This is Eric Severide. I don't know how many of you have heard of him. He was the editor of the Minnesota Daily back in the day. He emerged as perhaps the most prominent journalist of his generation. And in the 60s and 70s, every night on TV, you would hear him synthesize the news. And there was a narrative as a result that was widely understood or shared among the public. Now, you could say that's not a very democratic thing. And of course, nowadays we have many, many more outlets. You can find information and views that agree with yours in a very drop of a hat. That's a good thing, but it's also a problem. It leads to a certain fragmentation. It's very difficult today for the average citizen to follow world events. It takes a lot of effort in sifting through a lot of often contradictory media sources. And so we exist in this environment, and I think it keeps people from being more aware of what's happening outside of our borders and keeps them, therefore, from engaging. We're talking tonight about careers of service, not just for the profit motive, but for service, for serving. There are many people in our private sector now who are doing that. Bill Gates is devoting now his foundation to issues in Africa, especially issues of food and health. He gave $2 billion away in the last few years. He's set to give $2 billion more. So the private sector today is vibrant, and there are many private foundations where you can find very meaningful work nowadays, some of them based here in the Twin Cities, who are quite involved in development. Of course, there are non-government organizations. I've been involved with two, with the Atlantic Council and now with the Oslo Center of Peace and Human Rights. We're working on a lot of issues. It's based in Norway, but we're active here in the Twin Cities as well. This is a vibrant sector. Since 2008, there's been a fair amount of consolidation, however. There were more NGOs before the crisis. The big fish have been eating the little fish. And as a result, even though it's still a very vibrant sector, it's a little more restrained or consolidated now than it was. We have some great NGOs here in the Twin Cities. And if you're looking at internships, a place like the American Refugee Committee, the Center for the Victims of Torture, Advocates for Human Rights, these are nationally and internationally known institutions. And then, of course, there's government, which arguably has reached its low point with the near government shutdown, the near default. The idea of working for the government does not appeal to a lot of people nowadays. In our Constitution, sort of the be-all and end-all of what we're about is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? These are all very individual values. Just across the border in Canada, the same set of higher ideals are peace, order, and good government. It's a very different approach to the polity. In countries like China, government jobs are the most coveted. Your average young Chinese coming out of the university wants a government job above all. Now, there's some altruism, but unfortunately, there's other motives. You can make money semi-legally if you're in the right government job. So, but they prize the stability, the job stability. And I find actually among my students, there are more and more who see a government career as potentially more stable than, say, NGO work. In any event, it's something that where there's a lot going on, a lot of need, whether it's USAID, Agency for International Development, the State Department, which I know best on diplomacy. I'll be talking about that in a minute. Anybody who has any questions about entering these fields, I would be very happy to offer advice. I am on an advisory board at State still, and I'm very aware of the entry process for these positions. It's tricky. It's sublime and it's difficult working for the government. And I think the person who summed it up most eloquently is this gentleman, George Kennan, probably our most famous diplomat, one of the very first who came in when the Foreign Service exam was set up, a kid from Wisconsin, who in a telegram from Embassy Moscow outlined the containment doctrine, which became our policy toward Russia all during the Cold War. His memoirs won the Pulitzer Prize, and I highly recommend them. Very eloquently written. And he describes what it was like suddenly to have a job in government. He was in Geneva at our consulate. It was the summer of 1927. It was the 4th of July reception. He was the new vice consul, and every country on their national day will have a national reception. Ours is July 4th. So the personnel were receiving the people from the diplomatic corps there, and Kennan writes, there on that summer day, with the orchestra playing on the terrace, and the great lake, Lake Geneva, shimmering, I suddenly became aware that I had a reputable and appointed place in the proceedings. I was now responsible for the well-being of others. For this reason, I was something more than my usual self. I had a role to play, a useful, necessary, legitimate role, helpful to others, requiring no justification or apology. Under this welcome mask, I felt a hitherto unknown strength that was never entirely to fail me during my long Foreign Service career. This is true when you venture out and take positions like this. There is this element of a role, which can be a strengthening thing. It has a psychological impact. He also pointed, however, to the downside, at least of diplomatic service for the government. He pointed to the tragic contradiction of being a U.S. diplomat. And he said, probably a diplomat for any country, he said, the Foreign Service officer is taught and encouraged to believe that he's serving the national interest, the interest, that is, of the country as a whole in its external relations. He finds himself working, nonetheless, for people to whom this is not the main concern. Their main concern is domestic politics, and the interests they find themselves pursuing in this field of activity are not only often, but usually in conflict with the requirements of a sensible national diplomacy. I can vouch for some of what he's saying. You know, our system in the US is designed as what they call an invitation to struggle for foreign affairs. Separation of powers. The Congress has many powers. There are, by the way, good international jobs in our Congress. The committee staffs, all of our congressmen and senators have large staffs. Ted Kennedy had over 100 on his staff. And Congress is quite influential on all these international issues, including development. So it's a kind of a tormented structure we have. It comes close to breaking down once in a while, but that's just the way it is, and that's part of serving in government. And I would encourage all of you to consider it at least as an option, government service, in spite of the difficulties right now. Now, the backdrop for a career like this or a life like this, I would argue, are two absolutely fundamental shifts that are underway today in the world that impact us, especially as Americans, but more generally. And I want to describe those briefly. First one, I think it's fair to say that the Earth has reached an inflection point very clearly. The past 35 years of globalization and development have brought us and the planet to a whole new place, and your generation will be living the results of this. Just take population. 1776, our Declaration of Independence, the human population reached 1 billion after some serious growth. 1945, end of World War II, 2 billion. Right now, we're passing not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6, but 7. We're passing 7.2 billion people on this planet. It's estimated there'll be 2 billion more by about 2040, 2050, heading toward 10. This is huge, huge. And our intelligence agencies in Washington, and there are 16 of them, believe it or not, 16 intelligence agencies, come together every 5 years and they cooperate on a joint assessment looking ahead. It's called the National Intelligence Estimate. There's an unclassified version of this online. Obama gets the classified version, and theoretically it's one of the fundamental documents that he works from. And so This last one came out about 8 months ago now, maybe a little more, and it highlights a few tectonic shifts. And this is our intelligence agencies now, and they put their finger first and foremost on population. The world food supply is going to have to double, they predict, double over the next 30 to 40 years. Now, it's only 2 billion more, right? But diets are changing. People are eating meat, especially in Asia, that never used to eat meat before. Meat is extremely resource intensive. It takes 15,400 liters of water to produce 1 kilo of meat. So as these diets change, the stress on the planet is going to increase. 2 billion more. Africa, and this is the UN projection, is projected to go from 1 billion people today to 3.6 billion by the end of the century. That's huge. Now, you know, you can't do a straight line projection. The UN claims that it has factored in things. Who knows at this point, but that's their best shot. The country of Nigeria will have over 800 million people, heading toward 850 million people, coming almost up to China. Other countries in the West will be declining, Japan going from 120 to 80 million. Russia is in the midst of a demographic collapse, largely lifestyle related. For every 100 people born in Russia today, 170 die, 170. So their population is plummeting. So 97% of the increase will be in the developing world going forward. This is huge. China is one of the countries trying to adapt with this. This is a city that's already in place. Build it and they will come. This is the town of Ordos in China. The Chinese are planning to move several hundred million people off the countryside into cities like this. There's an article in the New York Times just the other day about suicides in these new cities. I don't know how I would feel living there, but apparently there are some real psychological issues with the way they're going about this. The other aspect, of course, of this rapid population growth is the impact on the climate. This photo was taken at noon in Beijing last January, during what they call the air apocalypse, something that is unprecedented. The amount of pollution, I have friends living in Beijing who said it was archly painful even to breathe during this period. And it went on for quite a while. The city of Harbin had a similar event just 2 weeks ago. That's our sister city here in the Twin Cities. I always think of Los Angeles as rather polluted. LA is in the orange there. And driving in the valley there, you know, is like, well, look at compared with the Chinese cities. This is last March. So these are issues that are going to have to be addressed. Climate, population. It's going to be difficult. For example, India has 400 to 500 million peasants who do not have access to electricity right now. They have a big plan to quickly bring them online by burning huge amounts of coal over the next 20 to 30 years. In the climate change talks, Europeans and the United States are asking India, isn't there another way to do this? This is going to be a huge impact on the climate. And the answer is, look, come to us when we've reached your level of development. Who are you to tell us that we cannot achieve the same status as you? So these are issues that are going to be very challenging in terms of development and all of our lives. Our intelligence agencies put their finger on what they see as perhaps the key issue going forward, and that's water. Water, water, water. This is going to be huge in the future. They estimate that by 2030 or 2040, it is 50% of all humans will live in a water-stressed area, 50%. There'll be 40% more demand for water than supply. And so a big part of the work in this area will be on trying to offset this. It has a huge impact on food. Water, food, and climate are all interrelated. And it's actually these set of issues, I believe, that set off the Arab Spring. This is the protest in Tunisia. The photo is a young Mr. Bouazizi, who was living in Tunisia during a time of spiking food prices. He couldn't find a job. He was well educated. He tried to sell fruits and vegetables, and he was prevented from doing so, and he set himself on fire. I was at the State Department in May for a small meeting. You know, alums like myself are allowed to come back sometimes, and we had a meeting with John Kerry, a fairly small one. And the only point that he wanted to stress was that beneath all the issues we're seeing right now, of instability, for instance, in the Middle East, but not only, there's one basic issue: youth bulge and jobs. The population I talked about and the lack of jobs. And unless we address that, he said, nothing else is going to work. And at a time when our government is rather dysfunctional, where we can't really look to the government for much in the way of resources for these issues, his point was we've got to learn now to bring all the sectors together: corporate, NGO, government, academic, into really well-coordinated programs. And I think you're going to be seeing some of this going forward. I know I have some people I know at Cargill who said that they've started to get some contact along these lines. You know, it's tough. I mean, our corporations may be asked to ignore their bottom line. I mean, for example, does it make economic sense right now to invest in Egypt? Isn't the investment at risk? But we must help countries like this. We must, right? So these are going to be very, very difficult trade-offs. Now, another area that they point out is technology. Now, you know, the new technology is actually helping the developing world. You can use cell phones to get education way out. I have friends working for UNESCO in Southeast Asia who are using the new technologies to quickly develop innovative new programs to bring education way out into the very rural areas. You don't need a lot of infrastructure. Just teach the mothers out there, especially, how to use some of the tech. So it's got a lot of benefits, obviously, but it's got a downside, and our intelligence agencies in their reports said, actually, the threat outweighs. There's a tremendous cyber threat out there. Our systems can be so easily disrupted. And it's a big topic, and you know, a lot of our basic internet infrastructure consists of small cables that go under the sea. There was a situation a couple of years ago in Romania where a woman was digging in her garden and came upon one of these cables and cut into it, and connection was disrupted all through Europe, literally. So these systems are vulnerable. Now, we're not too popular right now because of our NSA spying, obviously. That's, you know, that's the other downside to this. If body language can tell you something, this is Dilma Rousseff, the president of Brazil. She is so angry at us. She canceled her state dinner with Obama over this NSA spying business. You know, Obama's only had 6 state dinners in his entire presidency, and there was only one scheduled for this year, Brazil, and they pulled out. She's trying to bring Brazil out of the US-based web. And now we're coming to my next point, the big change. This is almost operational. This is a new internet structure that the BRIC countries, I'll be talking about them in a minute, are developing to try to not have to use our services as much. This is the way the world is going. And our intelligence agencies highlighted as their final point, and this is now the second big shift. First is the inflection point for the planet. Second shift, we are moving toward, and in fact are in, a multipolar world. This is going to take a lot of getting used to in this country. This is something we don't particularly want to give a name to. Other countries, here are the BRIC countries themselves. This is kind of an artificial, it was a fellow from Goldman Sachs coined the term some years ago, Jim O'Neill, and it stuck, and now they are starting to cooperate amongst themselves. There's a new BRIC as of last year, South Africa. They've been brought on. Largely, China wanted South Africa. China is very active in Africa and wanted an African representative among the BRICS. So the world has been transformed in the past 35 years with the opening of China in 1978, the collapse of the Soviet Union, 11 time zones, the opening of India. 3 billion new consumers were out there. And Eurasia has historically been the center of world economics and politics. About 70% of world GDP was in this region up until the 1700s. So the rise of the West is fairly recent historically. And this region is returning to the center. Now, this is hard for us to, here's the new president of China and the premier, Mr. Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang. This is the world that we're used to in the United States. After World War II, we found ourselves in the middle here, where we controlled over half of world GDP. We engaged in alliances for the first time. We basically, relying on our Navy, set up a two-ocean paradigm with alliances on both sides. As I say, most of Eurasia was out of the game. I think it's a telling statistic that in 1980, 95% of world free trade was accounted for by just 17 countries along this free trade and along this area. Free trade was not disruptive then. The labor costs among these countries were fairly uniform. You did not have the outsourcing that came on with the opening of China, especially. So it's a new situation, and we're trying to figure out how to position ourselves. And I want to briefly talk about how we're reacting, because how we react will determine how committed we are to the outside world, how committed we are, for example, to development. The fate of all that hangs on these issues. Now, I'm showing you a lot of historical figures today. I want to briefly mention what I think are the four phases of the way the U.S. has approached the world historically. And the last two phases have come in very quick succession, and they are at the heart of the polarization right now in the U.S. The first phase is epitomized by this character. This is the first photo we have of a living U.S. president. This is John Quincy Adams, who was our sixth president. This was taken after he was out of office. But he summed up, I think, in a very eloquent way, what our early presidents warned about. For Washington, for Jefferson, the role of the United States was to build a city on a hill, to avoid entangling alliances. As Washington said, to avoid the insidious wiles of foreign involvement. We were going to protect our economy and develop it. The best thing that we could do for the world was to serve as a functioning model to the world. And that was our default mode. And in 1821, John Quincy Adams summed this up and said, this is a rough quote, wherever the banner of freedom and independence shall be unfurled in this world, there will be America's heart and her benediction. But America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. It's the friend and well-wisher to the freedom of all. It is the guarantor only of her own. You hear this quoted a lot in Washington today by that part of our population that believes that America needs to get back to nation building at home. And it's not just the Rand Pauls. This is found within both parties right now, the idea that America must get back to its original vocation, which was to create a functioning model. This lasted really up until World War II, although the later phases were foreshadowed by Woodrow Wilson, who in 1914 went to the Versailles Conference after World War I with 14 points in his hand. The famous 14 points, all of them having to do with idealistic principles of democracy, freedom, independence of peoples, and the idea being that the U.S. should actively promote these. Now, this was a radical departure from the original outlook, and it didn't last. There was a lot of skepticism. In Europe, the president of France at the Versailles Conference, Lloyd George, when he got the document, was quoted to say, "Moses gave us his 10 commandments, and we broke them all. Wilson has given us his 14 points. We shall see." And of course, our Congress withdrew from the League of Nations, and we went into our old mode. But his idea of active involvement, especially for freedom and human rights, arose again and is with us now in both parties. Both of our political parties harken back to Wilson now, except for these new voices coming up in both parties who harken back more to our early presidents, and that's the debate for us right now. This is the Berlin Airlift, the second phase of our involvement with the world, World War II. There was a clear-cut threat, good guys, bad guys, communism, capitalism, freedom, tyranny, and a nuclear threat to boot. So we went against our early presidents, and we entered into entangling alliances with the outside world. This was a unifying threat. Our country was unified, as they used to say, politics stops at the water's edge. And when the Soviets sent up a Sputnik, here's Khrushchev at the UN, we responded with a massive education program especially for science. So the Cold War was a time when the U.S. really was focused. And our engagement in development at that time was very much in terms of the Cold War. We would go into countries where we felt there might be a Soviet threat. And the Peace Corps was developed and other aid institutions along these lines in the context of the Cold War. Now, as I said, the next two have come in rapid succession. When Mikhail Gorbachev began opening the Soviet Union and it collapsed, the Cold War was over. It's like the world became demagnetized. We began to fall into disagreement ourselves. What was the threat out there if it was no longer the Soviet Union? Here's Vladimir Putin between two traditions of US policy. Bush Sr. was much more of a realist. But the third phase of our approach to the world was enunciated by George W. Bush after 9/11, when we did not know what had happened. Why had they attacked us? Why did they hate us? And President Bush said, they hate us because of our freedoms. They hate us because of who we are. We're in a war. We're in a war like World War II. And it's a war on terror. To offset this threat, we must engage in transformational diplomacy. I was still in the State Department when we were reconfigured for transformational diplomacy. We were told as diplomats, the role of a diplomat is no longer to analyze or negotiate with a country, it is to transform countries. The idea was, wherever the human heart is not free, you have the danger of terrorism. It was called transformational diplomacy, and it was the idea that got us into Afghanistan and Iraq, obviously. George Bush announced to the UN in 2006 that the US reserved the right to intervene militarily anywhere in the world in the name of human freedom. So this was operationalizing, if you will, this idea of human rights and freedom. So, and that outlook is still very much alive in our country. But in 2008, the voters voted for something different. And this is then the final phase, and I'll be concluding here soon on this. President Obama, when he came in his first inaugural, said, look, the threats to us today are global. There are things like climate change, nuclear. These are threats that we must cooperate with other countries to solve, including countries like China and Russia. So transformational diplomacy was out. The idea of getting involved was to jointly meet these threats. In fact, Hillary Clinton said we no longer use the term war on terror. And you'll see it never is anymore in the official documents. The Obama critique of this other worldview was that it got us into counterinsurgency, into countries like Iraq and Afghanistan with hundreds of thousands of troops, when really we should be engaged in counterterrorism more narrowly. And that means drones and special forces, and that's what we're seeing now. A great reluctance to put troops on the ground, relying on these higher technologies. And, he said, the biggest problem with this is we took our eye off the ball of the main story of our age, and that's the rise of China. We were not looking, and China's been quietly rising. So we have pivoted now. We've pivoted to Asia. And we'll see, how this goes forward. Pivot is an interesting term. It implies pivoting away from something. And so are we pivoting away from the Middle East? Is that what we're doing? We've since changed the name to rebalancing to get around this. But we are definitely looking more now to China. Let me give you an example. When Obama came in, the Chinese, having risen now, are proposing a trade area. It would be China plus the countries in red, ASEAN, over 2 billion people. This will be the world's third great trade area after NAFTA and the EU. And it excludes us. We're not part of this. Now, as I say, we're used to this structure, right? We don't want lines drawn across. So Part of our pivot is we've proposed a different trade area we call the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You'll probably read about this, the TPP, to include all the countries around the Pacific, Chile and coming up through Mexico, and a lot of development and even aid work, the idea is, will take place within the TPP, within those structures. They exclude China. They exclude China, and that's the problem. That's the problem. Our allies in Asia are trying to decide what to do in terms of being drawn in two directions between the US and China. So it's going to, I'll sort of stop there. I have a couple of things to say about what they're looking for, what the strengths are for getting jobs, for example, in the public sector, how to prepare yourselves a little bit, but I can maybe save those for questions. I think I've gone just about a half an hour here. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to your comments and your questions, both oral and written.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
So we're ready to take some questions. I have one for Tom. As we're talking, I have the impression of swimming in the ocean of issues. So that was too big. So we see in the world, we have problems all over the world, but we would like to get involved, but we don't know how. Can you tell us briefly how really we can get involved? You have young students here,
Yep.
master's students, undergraduate students, and some even in the high school. They would like to get involved. They would like to do something to change the world. What
Right.
can they do?
Well, you know, prepare yourself, and I'm going to give you a couple of pointers on how to prepare for some of these jobs. And then keep your eye out for the opportunities. I mean, you know, there are graduate programs and also university programs, which I think this being one of them, that can point you in some very specific directions in your coursework. There are internships out there. I mentioned the ones here in the Twin Cities. And then there's the necessity to scope out the range of possibilities, because when I was graduating from college, really the Foreign Service was kind of the one thing. I'd been in the Peace Corps, and the Foreign Service seemed to be the most likely thing. Well, now there's endless possibilities. So many more NGOs, international organizations, corporations that are getting involved in this. So it's a vast landscape, which takes some looking into. Now, I can tell you, and especially looking at, say, the Foreign Service, but also USAID, and some of these other semi-governmental things, what they'll be looking for when you apply are signs of motivation. Motivation, motivation, motivation. And you'll be asked to write personal statements in which the clearer you make your motivation, the better chances you have of getting the job. They want people who are sincerely motivated. So think hard about why you want to do this. In fact, for yourself, think about why you're interested in this and have it clarified in your mind. Language study is a sign of motivation. Nobody expects you to be fluent in a language, but if you've taken the time and shown the interest, that's a clear sign of motivation. They look for that very specifically. So do languages. Even if it's a struggle, even if you're not fluent yet, just to do them is worth it. They're looking for signs that you can handle the kind of life that you'll be in, that you'll be away from your family, you'll be abroad, you'll be in sometimes very difficult situations. So they'll be looking at that. And so any time you spend abroad, studying abroad, Peace Corps is, especially if you're interested in development, is seen as a very good preparation. The Peace Corps is something that's open to everyone. And so the time abroad fulfills their curiosity about whether you can handle this. And then, you know, it's probably a good idea to marry your interests up with a skill. For example, water. If you're interested in development, zero in on an aspect of development that interests you, and try to craft your studies around that. Management itself, you know, there are courses in NGO management. I know you get a lot of that here too. This is also very useful. And then there's one other thing, and I think this is true not just in the Foreign Service. I see this a lot, also what corporations are looking for. They're looking for a kind of clarity. A clarity of expression, both written and oral. A sense that you can set priorities clearly, You know, a lot of people have computer skills now, that's all great. But the old skills of clear writing and clear presentation are withering severely. And a candidate who comes with that, and almost anything you apply for now, you'll be asked to write a personal statement. For the Foreign Service, it's endless writing assignments. They want to see how you write. And when you come to the oral exam, which is a group exam, they want to see how you present yourself, how clear you are, how much of a team player you seem to be. Think about it. If you're working in an international environment, different cultures, different agencies, clarity is key. Clarity of communication is the coin of the realm. So I would keep strong on those. You know, in international affairs, maybe because of the French were so important, the number 3 is essential. Everything can be seen in threes, 3 points. You know, when you listen to a UN speech or anything international, it's always, well, there are 3 reasons for this, and there are 3 of this and 3. You know, religions are based around trinities, and you know, if you have 2 points, it seems to be oppositional. The 3rd point brings it into flux. Anyway, kind of practice, if you're asked to write or present, quickly to break things down into 3. Now, there can be 4 sometimes, obviously, but this is a trick that Foreign Service officers learn. And I think it's useful a lot of places. So, you know, there's going to be a big opening coming. It's estimated that our diplomacy, our US government aid positions should be doubled. We have way too few people. Bill Clinton downsized our foreign affairs establishment by 40% in the 90s. We had won the Cold War, right? And then came 9/11. And with all these new responsibilities, we didn't ramp up. We didn't put money into personnel. So USAID, severely understaffed. State Department, severely understaffed. It's true of a lot of other agencies in Washington. When Obama came in, he and Hillary decided to try to increase the Foreign Service in USAID by 25%. And the first 2 years, in 2009 and 2010, these were the halcyon days for coming. They let in 900 new Foreign Service officers. I mean, the year I came in, it was 80. And I had quite a few students passing and going in. The door slammed shut in 2010 with the 2010 midterms, and it's been going down ever since with the sequester and the government breakdown. Actually, the problem is worsening again. So at some point here, the floodgates are going to open again. And so what a lot of people do is try to keep their oar in, you know, keep their applications going. You can take these exams every year and hope that it opens up. So yeah, I guess that's, you know, right now, I know the Foreign Service best. 60% of our diplomats have come in since 9/11. It's a very young service, although the median age for coming in now, people come in for a second career as well. So, I mean, I'll be happy, you know, this is too short a time to really go into this, but anybody who has questions, I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Can we take some questions? If you're not loud enough, you can come forward and speak to the microphone.
You mentioned earlier that it's kind of a hot color color black philosophy, especially with India trying to get online or be annexed the rural populations.
Yeah.
And I started thinking, well, it's probably the same with Iran and trying to be nuclear power. Also, Greece telling them to stop the printing presses. They'll kind of seem hypocritical from us.
Yeah.
So my question as a state officer, what do you say to rebut that?
Well, and did you all hear the question? I mean, you know, in a sense, who are we to tell a country like India how they should develop, or Greece, and how, as an official, do you respond to that? And it's tricky, you know. I really believe one other skill I would develop, quite frankly, is a knowledge of history and a knowledge of the narratives that other people have about themselves. The more you understand, I mean, India has a narrative that I briefly described. Iran has a strong narrative on why they want to have nuclear weapons. Not weapons, but nuclear power, as they say. And so as a US official, it's a problem. And this is where the role becomes contradictory. You know, you have to kind of give the line of the US government, and that's what they want to hear from you. They don't want your opinion. They want to know what they're dealing with. So there again, clarity of communication. After you've done that, you can sit back and say, well, isn't that a strange policy? Or, you know, you get to know officials you're working with as friends, and so you kind of operate on two levels that way. But at the moment, whether the policy is crazy or not, at that moment, the other side wants to know what it is, because they want to be able to deal with it. I was going to give a couple of examples of the narratives that are out there, and I'll do just two here. How we deal with other countries, and to my mind, the importance of understanding their narratives. We're hedging against China. We're trying to, in a sense, not block, but let's go to Washington, D.C. We're trying to hedge against China's rise. And so here's Xi Jinping visiting with Obama. What's happening between us and China is as old as history itself. You can go back to Thucydides, the famous Greek historian who wrote the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Greece. And he summed up the reason for that war in one sentence. And the rise of Athens alarmed the other Greeks. So how alarmed are we, the US, by this rising power? Historically, this does not end well. History is littered with wars that have eventuated from situations like this. And I find it very interesting that when Xi Jinping came to Washington, at the top of his agenda for discussion was Thucydides. The Chinese raised Thucydides with us, saying, look, let's not be dictated by history. We both know what's happening here. Let's find a new kind of relationship. I find that a fascinating example of reaching into another, they were reaching into the Western tradition to try to talk our language to us. I think that was just an amazing thing. And one more brief example when it comes to, the Middle East, I'll say this very briefly. The Middle East is hard to understand. What is Iran doing? I think, this is a digression, but just briefly, there are three basic peoples in the Middle East, ethnic groups, and it's not just the religions. And to understand them helps simplify a lot. The Semites, of course, are the indigenous people, the Arabs and the Jews. It's amazing how closely, look at the central Semitic tongues, Arabic and Hebrew are like this. The Arabs and the Jews are related by blood, by language, by religious organization. Semitic peoples have decentralized religion. There are no popes in the Semitic religions. They're the first important group. The second group, the Turks, originated out in Central Asia, where it says Uyghur there. That's the original homeland of the Turks. And they still want more independence in China. But they moved across Central Asia, in large part as foot soldiers to Genghis Khan. It was like a snowball developing. And when the dust settled, they had the Ottoman Empire, which for 500 years ruled the Middle East. And here is the way it was divided up. The Arab nation was shattered. They were divided up into tiny principalities. It's a frustrated nation that is yearning for greater unity. Iran retained its empire status, as did Turkey, the Ottomans. Now the third group, and I'm really digressing, but it's so essential for understanding this, and I'll get to Iran briefly, the Indo-Europeans. This is the great Indo-European migration, which took place starting 4,000 years ago. The homeland of these people was north of the Black Sea, and they moved in several directions. They moved down into India and formed the Sanskrit culture of northern India, pushing the Indus Valley civilization south. Sanskrit is Indo-European. They moved into Persia, Iran, the land of the Aryans. These are not Semites. These are not Turks. These are Indo-Europeans. These groups do not identify with each other. They're totally different. And then another group went into Europe, and all of our languages in Europe, from Russian to ancient Greek to Latin to Norwegian to English, are all Indo-European languages related to Sanskrit, related to Persian. When you hear of Afghanistan, that's a Sanskrit ending, stan, which is the same as our word stand, to be in a place, same language. So the main Indo-European peoples in the Middle East, and this is important for our foreign, here's all the languages coming out of this family. Not Turkic, not Semitic. Obviously, there are three basic Indo-European peoples in this region. The Iranians, the Kurds, who live up in northern Iraq, Turkey and Syria. They're the ancient Medes of the Bible. They're an ancient people. And after World War I, President Wilson was in favor of a Kurdish state. because of this history. And then the third group, and this is very fateful for us, the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. Probably the ancient Scythians. They're Indo-European. The government we've brought into Afghanistan is largely Turkic, the northern Turkish tribes. When you've said that, you've said all you need to say about our problems there. So, the drama right now in the Middle East is after 500 years under the Turks, the Arab peoples don't want to come under the Persians. And that's why we're being implored by Israel and by Saudi Arabia especially to if necessary, attack Iran. This is, of course, Tahrir Square. The Arabs feel that they are deserving this. I'm really digressing, but just briefly. There's Lawrence of Arabia. Anybody who's seen the film Lawrence of Arabia, it's quite accurate, actually. And King Faisal. King Faisal was promised a state, a large Arab state that would include Syria, what is now Syria. There was no country of Syria, or Iraq. But he was lied to. In fact, the British and the French had already planned in the Sykes-Picot Agreement to divide it up amongst themselves. And that border is the border between Iraq and Syria. It's an artificial border, and so what's happening with our invasion of Iraq, this is the Shia crescent in the Middle East. It's turning into a regional sectarian war between the two branches of Islam. And with Iran supporting one, Saudi Arabia, and they're trying to draw us in to this. This is very huge. The Shiites are a majority in Iraq with the Sunnis. It's just the opposite in Syria, where the Shiites are the tribe of Assad. In the middle is a Sunni glob, and that's where the uprising is taking place. Al-Qaeda is called the Al-Qaeda state of Syria and Iraq. So this is huge what's happening. It's a return of history. And the more we know about this history, the better off we'll be. Now, there's a new head of Iran, Mr. Rouhani. Can we reach an agreement with Iran? The Iranians have a narrative about this. This is 1953. This is President Mossadegh, Man of the Year. In the background, you see raised fists from the oil fields. He decided it was time to nationalize the oil fields and kicking out Anglo-British Petroleum, which is BP. BP used to be called Anglo-British Petroleum. And so he set about this, and I won't go into details, but we decided with the British to stage a coup. This is Kermit Roosevelt. This is the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. He was sent into Iran in 1953, and from the embassy, organized the coup. Madeleine Albright, as Secretary of State, apologized for that coup publicly to the Iranian people. So if you're an Iranian, this is like 1953 all over again. They're telling us we can't have energy, our own energy. And as a result, the entire population from Shirin Ebadi, who's a Nobel Prize winner, strongly supports the program as well. And so this narrative is going to be very hard. And and of course, Israel has its own narrative. They're very worried about Iran, and especially the statements that Iran has made. So all of this history, all these clashing narratives are coming together. And the problem is that we have our own narrative right now. And I'll conclude this part just with these two maps. This is how Iran looks in the Middle East. It's a looming presence, right, to be dealt with. This is how Iran looks in Eurasia. You can see China right now is developing all these links of going global. And in Washington, there's a sense, we need stable allies in the region, and Iran is such a potential ally over time, because it's large, it's a stable state. So the narratives are just clashing right now in the Middle East. And it's getting so complex, and I'll conclude with this. There really is a pretty sizable proportion of our public now that thinks we should just draw back from all this. And I know you're hearing it. I'm hearing it a lot. It's not just Rand Paul, as I say, it's other parts of the spectrum. Will the US become more isolationist again going forward because of the complexity of all this and because of our domestic issues? If we do, what will that mean for our engagement on development as well? How focused will we be on building in other countries as opposed to building in Detroit or in our own? And So I think for your generation, this really is key. This is part of being clear about why you want this career, what you believe in, what you think, how it fits in with your own nationality, your own situation.
This goes with a question that we got online here for you, Tom. Why did you want to choose to join the Foreign Service? How did you get into the Foreign Service?
Well, it was, I was heading for college teaching. I was finishing a PhD. I'd been in the Peace Corps, and I was studying international issues, planning to teach. And I took and passed the Foreign Service exam, which I had not expected. I took the written exam. It's like the SATs, very similar to the SATs. I passed that, and I went for an oral exam and got in. And if you pass, you have 1 year to come in, or else you have to start it all over again, the whole process. So I decided to give it a try. And my university left the door open, said, we'll keep the door open for a number of years. If you want to come back, no problem. So I didn't think I was burning any bridges. When I came in, after the 6-week course, I got my list of potential assignments, right? Rome was one of them. But even more interesting, Fiji. I would have been responsible for thousands of square miles of ocean. And every 5 months, I would have been expected to go and visit the King of Tonga. Has anyone seen My Neighbor Totoro, the Miyazaki? I highly recommend the Miyazaki film. Anyway, the King of Tonga is rather large. It has small umbrellas. And I was so looking forward to calling on him and getting to it. But there was a crisis then in Henry Kissinger's office, and I got seconded right into the Secretary of State's office and saw a lot of history in a short period of time. That shows you how long ago I came in. And from then, one assignment after another was really quite interesting, and it was a great career. You change every 2 or 3 years. You get language training before you go. I had a year of Russian before I went, 3 hours, 3 in a class, 8 hours a day at full salary. For anyone who likes languages, both state and USAID are great. It's part of your career is to do languages. I saw the Foreign Service change. I saw U.S. diplomacy and the U.S. change in my career. Security became increasingly important. Our embassies are very well fortified now. Being abroad, even in an NGO, there are risks involved. A lot of bad actors consider even NGOs and aid workers a part of a U.S. government. Even the UN is being considered that way now. So security is more of an issue than it was when I first came in. But it's being dealt with. It's livable. So yeah, I have no regrets. It was a very interesting career. I'll tell you, it's a good first or second career. The median age for coming in is 36. You can do another career and then go for government, or vice versa. And as I say, at some point, the floodgates are going to open. We're going to have to at least double the service here at some point. Any other? Yes.
You said through the years that you saw government change as you were working for the State Department. So how does that work through presidents? Because obviously foreign policy changes
Yes.
as the president changes. So how does your job, how do you move through that?
Yeah, it's an important issue. We do our diplomacy different from almost every other nation. About 1/3 of our ambassadors are career appointees. They're people like Sam Kaplan here locally, people who have had stellar careers in other areas and then become diplomats. This is when we were a country that really didn't want to have much contact with the outside world, we had almost no diplomats. We had a lot of consuls. We had a lot of people who would go and issue visas. It was quite popular because you could keep all the money at posts. So Nathaniel Hawthorne, famous writer from the 19th, was a roommate of Franklin Pierce at Bowdoin College and was appointed to Liverpool. That was most of the traffic out of Europe was going through Liverpool. He made much more money there than he ever did writing anything. So that heritage has continued in the form of this 1/3, solid 1/3. So you're dealing with a new administration, you're also dealing with political appointees. So it makes it very complex. I often envied my colleagues. But on the other hand, in other countries, but on the other hand, I guess it does sort of ground our diplomacy in our domestic politics, for better or worse. And maybe that's a good thing. Every Secretary of State has a different style. Colin Powell used the State Department a lot. Jim Baker didn't. Hillary Clinton, most of her staff was from the outside. She was clearly already running for president. So she really didn't much, she went down to the cafeteria a lot, but she didn't use people at state very much. So it varies a lot. But I think up until recently, there's been a fairly uniform policy. I think with transformational diplomacy, it went in a different direction. So there's been a bit of whiplash the two last administrations. You know, are we supposed to be transforming? Are we supposed to be negotiating a nuclear deal with the Russians? What are we supposed to be doing? And that debate is deep with us between the two parties. I'll just give you an example of where the rubber hits the road here. In 2012, Obama is calling for a $1 trillion cut in defense spending over the next 10 years as part of the sequester, $1 trillion, moving away from land forces toward the Navy. The Republicans said during the campaign that that's declinism. It's a matter of will. The 21st century should be an American century, and therefore we should increase defense spending by $2 trillion. So that's a $3 trillion difference. And it's reflective of two very different worldviews, in my view. One which is more accepting of a more multipolar world, and another which is still, for better or worse, in that structure that emerged from World War II with a very exceptional role for the US. And I don't see that difference going away anytime soon. Any other questions about either careers or issues, or I can stay as long as you can, so, yeah.
From a language perspective, can you speak to if there's any specific language that's trending in demand?
Yeah, they have what they call critical languages at state. And actually you get a lot of extra money if you study and learn them. It's one of the, there's a lot of incentives. Now, obviously Chinese. We are opening up many, many, many new consulates in China. The Chinese are starting to travel a lot. And so there'll be a lot of need for visa issuance and other legal matters. So Chinese definitely. Arabic is a very high priority language. I think the more we inch toward Iran, if we do, Farsi will become very important. Because I'll tell you that in our Pentagon, yeah, I'd say it's a majority view that this is our natural ally at some point, Iran. I mean, it's completely off the map in terms of our current politics. But that's coming, I think. And until 1979, they were a very close ally. Other languages, well, I mean, Spanish, you know, there's a lot of Spanish-speaking posts. It's not a critical criteria language. Pashto, as long as we're in Afghanistan, is a criteria language. Russian, a little less so. We've kind of neglected Russia, even though there are these 15 new republics. I opened our embassy in Georgia. I was the first chargé d'affaires in Georgia. And I remember I had to do a New Year's greeting on their national radio. And I spoke pretty good Russian, so I said, well, I'll do it in Russian. They said, no, you know, we're independent now. It must be in Georgian or English, not Russian. So our diplomats going to Tbilisi now take Georgian. Yeah. So the Foreign Service Institute is vast. I mean, they teach like 100 and something languages there. But it's good to study those languages. It's a leg up for coming in, yeah. Yes?
Thank you, Professor Hanson, for that beautiful exposition from many tonight.
Thank you.
For my question here, my question I'm asking you, you said during your elaboration, you indicated that President Clinton reduced staff internationally.
Yes.
Whereas the time of President Obama, there had been an increment, a significant increment.
Tried to, yes.
Yeah. Now, if so, what are some of the underlying factors that give rise for President Clinton to reduce staff and President Barack Obama to decrease staff?
Good question.
5%?
Very good question. Yeah, very good question. Well, as I say, you know, the mindset of the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed unexpectedly, I can think of no other example in history where an empire just simply lets go the way they did with this peaceful transition. There was a sense, yes, that we'd won the Cold War, and the idea of a Washington consensus that was taking hold. The book of the moment was Francis Fukuyama's End of History. Boy, that seems like hubris in retrospect, but yeah, end of history. And so why did we need this? Why did we need all this? You know, Daniel Moynihan, who was a Democratic senator, called maybe for abolishing the CIA. But why should we have that? So as part of Clinton's, quote, reinventing government, I mean, Clinton had a lot in common with Republican administrations in retrospect. And so he cut back the government generally and the Foreign Service and State Department in particular. Now, so when 9/11 hit suddenly, We were into counterinsurgency and nation building. And a lot of diplomats were taken out of their diplomatic roles and sent over to Afghanistan and Iraq as part of provincial reconstruction teams, PRTs, with the military to develop villages. They were like mayors of towns. I mean, they were doing totally non-democratic work or non-diplomatic. You know, in the 19th century, Britain had a colonial service that did things like this. They would not have taken this out of their diplomats the way we did. So when Obama came in, and our embassies around the world, there were 1,400 unfilled positions. Nobody there. Simply nobody there. And this is what led to this call for immediate rectification of this. And we're slowly bringing people back from Afghanistan and Iraq. And we did increase by 17% in those first 2 years. So it was a great time to be coming into the Foreign Service. But it's going down now. We're letting in less than attrition right now because of the budget situation. So that back and forth, it's you know, with 9/11 had a big impact, end of the Cold War. I think now we're maybe going to stabilize in a mode in which this is a complicated world. We're going to need an active, informed diplomacy. And this is what our intelligence agencies are saying. They're saying it's a multipolar world. You got to fend for yourself in this more complex environment. And that's why I stress the need to understand other narratives. I think when we were so much the center of things, we didn't see the need for that as much. And I think we're going to need it. I personally think we're going to need it a lot now. In your generation, it'll be a skill for you in your careers, I think. Any other? Yes?
So in recent years, they've discovered that a lot of focusing on one particular issue distorts other issues in the developing world.
Yep.
You spoke about creating programs within the government, private sector, and NGOs. How do you think a program like that would really affect these distorted issues?
That's a good question. And as I say, what Kerry discussed, I think at this stage is somewhat notional. Although, as I travel around, you know, all of our embassies now have kind of development entrepreneurship programs where they advertise and say, any, say, Norwegian or, I don't know, Brazilian company or NGO that has an idea regarding especially development, bring it to us. Bring it to the embassy. And we will try to find ways to work with you. The implication is we'll even perhaps try to finance you to some extent. So it's been operation. I think we're doing the same thing domestically, although I see it more clearly in our embassies that this is happening. But I agree, you know, we're kind of a one-issue country in a way. We focus on, it's been Afghanistan and Iraq to the exclusion. We're starting to turn more to Africa now. There's a sense, you know, George Bush with his AIDS initiative, and you know, Africa is coming on in many ways. Foreign investment is picking up in Africa, so that seems to be getting more attention again. And the Gates Foundation very much looking at Africa. So how realistic will it be for, as I say, if I'm the head of government relations at Cargill and I get approached by the State Department with a specific agricultural, say, food security project, someplace where they're active, and let's work together on this. In fact, there's a couple of NGOs on the ground there. Let's bring them in too. All right, that's all well and good. But for Cargill, ultimately, they've got to be looking at it in terms of their bottom line, right? And that's where I wonder. A lot of the money right now is in the corporate sector, right? And how we're going to spring some of that money and some of that focus into this kind of an effort, I just don't know, because their goals are different. You know, to the extent they can do good things and maximize their profits, good. And I guess we got to find ways for that to happen. You know, we're not real long-term. The Chinese come in to places like Africa with a very long-term view. They don't pose any questions about what's your abortion policy or what's your government like, none of that. They simply say, look, let's strike a pragmatic bargain. We can do things for you, you have things we need. And usually it's a kind of a barter sort of infrastructure for resources. And there's no question about turning a profit immediately. The Chinese don't think that way. And to that extent, they have an advantage on these issues. And to that extent, they're actually doing some good things in their own interest around the world. And an example, I don't know if I have this. By the way, this is the new USAID team in Myanmar. We just opened up a USAID office in Burma, and it's going to be a large office there. And, there'll be a lot of rural education, all that sort of thing going on. Here's Afghanistan, right? As I mentioned, the Pashtuns here are Indo-European. They're basically the source of the Taliban. Not all Pashtuns are Taliban by far. And the Pashtun nation is artificially divided by something called the Durand Line with Pakistan here. That was drawn by a British civil servant in 1893, separating the Pashtun people. When we hear about the tribes in Waziristan, that's the Pashtuns. And eventually they're going to want their own state. But here's the resources of Afghanistan, almost all of which now are under contract to China. The big one is the Ainak copper mine, where just last week a billion-dollar development was announced. So while we have been, out there with our troops and fighting off, China, with no military presence at all, has come in quietly. And what's happening in Afghanistan now is pretty much this. If you read in the paper recently that we have just, in the last 2 weeks, assassinated, once with drones, and then somebody assassinated another high Taliban official who have been negotiating with Karzai and with Pakistan certain agreements for Afghanistan after us. And I think the Afghan government is turning now to the idea of working with Pakistan and China in a kind of a new Silk Road. We have a different Silk Road proposal for them that we're trying to get them to adopt. And India is angry at this, right? Because they think that Afghanistan should be their ally. So this is, and China's doing this for economic reasons. As I say, there's no military dimension to what they're doing. Once they have the interest established, maybe then, but they don't have any real projection power right now. The Chinese military they spend less than 1/6 of what we spend on the military. A lot of it is focused on Taiwan and immediate defense. So yeah, I don't know how we're going to organize ourselves for long-term sustained engagement and development. I see the strong desire to do it and to engage all aspects as I described. So we'll see how it works. Any other final comments or observations?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, for those of us that are thinking about taking the Foreign Service exam and talked about, that clarity of language, that clarity of public speaking, if there's a specific skill that we feel like we're lacking, are there any preparatory skills, workshops, or anything that you would recommend?
Yeah.
Undergo?
There's a lot. There's a lot online. There's a lot of sort of online chat rooms and resources. Have you been to the State Department website?
I have,
Yes, www.careers.state.gov. And there are sample tests. There are all kinds of things there. I'm not aware of. I'm sure that there are prep courses that exist. I think they tend to be out on the East Coast. I don't think we have a density here of people applying the way they do on the coast. And by the way, that gives us an advantage. I think it's easier to get into these jobs from this part of the country because there is fewer people aware of them and applying for them, ironically. So, and that's certainly true of State Department internships, which I highly recommend for anyone who is still, say, a sophomore. Every summer, there are internships in all of our embassies around the world. You can go to Brazil or Turkey, it's great, and you actually do real work during the summer because typically the person in the position that you're filling has left by June to start language training. Their successor wants to take home leave before coming to post, so they'll get there late August, and the interns really get involved. It's a wonderful program. And you see the landscape. Every embassy has what they call a country team. Many, many, many different agencies are at an embassy. It's not just Foreign Service, Commerce, Agriculture, military attaches, FBI. And that's where you see how many international jobs there are in the government, really. It goes way beyond the Foreign Service. So a State Department internship, I really recommend if students are interested that they go for it. Ideal time is after your junior year to do that, or during grad school, between 2 years of grad school. You have to be coming back into the program that you left to go on the internship. So But you know, in terms of maximizing that ability to communicate, I just keep the simple things in mind. You know, active verbs, set, you know, finite number of points. You know, and in the oral exam, this is true for a lot of government jobs. You know, you're not getting a job at Goldman Sachs. They're looking for, when they're assessing you, they're looking at a future colleague, somebody who can deal effectively with different cultures. And so if you're trying to storm the ramparts during the exam, which happens, it lessens your chances of getting in. But I don't know, as I say, there are ways of getting at, especially the writing part. Read the paper a lot before